Welcome to Blind Spots, our course on gender and digital financial services. This is video 1, week 1, and here's our agenda. We're going to first discuss pre-digital ancient history, that period of time before around 2006, 2007, before digital financial services really came into their own. What were the main services back then? To whom were they delivered? How were they delivered? What lessons can we learn? What were some of the timelines, the insights, and the tensions? And what were our theories of change? Hint, we didn't have any. So, services and products, well, largely for women, but they always didn't start out that way. The services were microloans, meaning small loans for low-income businesses primarily, or micro savings, helping households and businesses save towards something meaningful, and microinsurance. Who were they for? Well, at first for men, mainly farmers, but also then for women, mainly micro-entrepreneurs. How were they delivered? Well, through microfinance institutions, which were NGOs, banks, cooperatives, or some other kind of institution. There were 3 basic approaches, well, actually many more, but we're just going to discuss 3. First, individual loans. This is where a microfinance institution, the bank or the NGO or the special kind of MFI, would offer men and women loans, but not necessarily to the poorest people because they needed those loans repaid, and the poorest perhaps couldn't do that. Specifically for business purposes to help them grow their enterprises, and often because it was an individual loan, they needed some kind of protection. So the MFI would require collateral. It could be an animal or a household asset, and a cosigner as well. The MFI would hire an agent, represented by the bicycle here, who would go to, in this case, the female farmer, and offer her a loan. The MFI would decide the loan amount, the interest rates, and the terms, and the woman would pay it back according to those terms. That's simple. And if she didn't, they would take her collateral or go after her cosigner. In the second approach, the group loan model, made famous by the Grameen Bank, things worked a little differently. Here, you might have a group of 5 or more women. The agent represented by the bicycle, forms this group. And the group gathers, and in many cases, they agree to guarantee each other's loans, called joint liability, meaning if we're in a group and you don't repay, and I'm in the same group as you, I'm somehow responsible for making sure all members of that group repay, including you who might be late. That turns out to be a bit of a problem later. Loans were often stepped, with each person in the group getting, say, I'm making this up, about $50. Then they could graduate to higher loans, let's say $75, and if they paid that back successfully, maybe $100. Here you can see this ladder of progress. Again, turned out to be a problem down the road. Some MFIs clustered small groups into larger centers, such as the Grameen Bank. And those centers could have 30, 40, 50, 60 people in them. They were big, but that's because the population was dense and it was efficient to gather people together like that. Typically, a microfinance institution promoted these groups and earned revenues from interest and fees on the loans. Many became hugely profitable. The third approach is a little different. Savings groups. These are groups where women gather together, and sometimes men too, and they form a group, and they're often formed with the help of an NGO. And all the capital comes from the members themselves. So it's not coming from an outside MFI. In this case, an agent working for an NGO organizes the group. And they've organized 8 members who agree to contribute 10 coins for each meeting for a total of 80 coins. And then in that meeting, in any given meeting, they may decide they want to lend out that money. In this meeting, they decide to lend out 40 coins to 2 members. But it could have decided to lend any amount as long as there was money in the coffer. The group really makes all the decisions regarding loan amounts, loan terms, interest rates, as well as savings amounts. At the end of the year, the loans have been repaid and the group splits the pot, each member taking home what she has put into it over the course of the year, plus her share of interest. A nice, tidy lump sum. Here's a timeline with milestones at the institutional level. You can see we start in the 70s and go through the 2010s. In the 70s, governments were often giving credit, and so were cooperatives, typically to farmers and often to men. Government loans were problematic. There was a huge problem in getting those loans repaid. Then we saw in the 80s Bank Rakyat Indonesia privatizing. It also had been a government bank and became very successful, reaching millions of micro-entrepreneurial borrowers in the country of Indonesia. We also saw self-help groups, kind of like savings groups, springing up throughout India, massively. Also, late 70s, 80s, early 80s, Women's World Banking launched. A huge network, and we're going to hear more about that in later videos. And SEWA launches, the famous bank for women that started with savings and spread throughout India. We also saw in the late 80s Grameen become a bank. Group lending scaled through organizations that copied the Grameen model throughout the world. Prodem in Bolivia became Banco Sol, meaning a nonprofit, an NGO transformed into a bank, and it ushered in an era of commercialization where organizations were urging each other to become commercial so they could attract infinite capital to grow, continue growing, and serve more borrowers. ProMujer launched a network throughout Latin America, and we saw group lending proliferate through Acción Finca and many others, also in the 90s. Savings groups began to really take off in the early 2000s. They were pioneered and tested in the 90s, but they scaled in the 2000s. Many organizations started using the Village Savings and Loan model, and it proliferated throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We saw in the 2000s Banco Compartamos in Mexico charging more than 100% interest rate, and then raising $1.2 billion in an IPO, making the owners very wealthy. M-Pesa launched in 2006, 2007, and it ushered in the new digital era. In the 2010s, SKS in India, copying the success of Compartamos and Grameen Bank, also held an IPO, but it quickly crashed because there were reports and lots of bad press around group members committing suicide because they felt over-indebted. Tensions and debates. Well, we had many camps. One camp might say, women like to be in groups for their financial services. And another camp would say, no, women value safety, convenience, and affordability in financial services. One camp would say women are powerful and run successful micro-enterprises. Another would say women are vulnerable, illiterate, and need lots of help. One camp would say women should use loans to build their micro-enterprises and grow them. Another would say, no, they should use loans to smooth household consumption. After all, people need to eat. They need to go to school. We have to help them out. One camp would say, don't lend to the very poor, and the other would say, lend to the very poor. It's all about poverty alleviation. One camp would say, institutions, microfinance institutions, must charge market rates of interest. And the reason for that was to be sustainable. Another would say, market rates are predatory. That's the whole point. That's why we started this microfinance industry. There's no limit to the interest people will pay, and we can't take advantage of them. One camp would say, financial sustainability of the institution comes first, commercialize your institution. And the other camp would say, no, the financial health of the individual comes first, and the health of their family, and other positive outcomes. There were also a timeline around narratives about women and men. So we're taking the same timeline, and we see that in the 70s, women were considered poor and vulnerable. So woman as beneficiary. She could receive our grants, but not much more. And then we saw women borrowing, and they were seen as empowered entrepreneurs in search of growing their businesses. Woman as producer. And then, well, women love to be in groups. They're socially minded. Women as socially minded. Women repay loans better than men. Woman as customer. But they're also great caretakers. They put household income towards family, food, health, and medicine. Woman as caretaker. And then women adopt and use digital financial services less than men do. Woman as late adopter. But what about men? Well, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the story often was men drink their income, or they're tardy in loan repayment. They won't get into groups. Man as cad. Oh, and then men adopt and use digital financial services more than women. Man as early adopter. You see how we talked about men and women? Men and women? We didn't really have a theory of change, which has become so popular now in the development world. Maybe we should have. A theory of change is simply a set of logic that says, if this happens, then that will follow. They're actually quite useful. If we had a theory of change, it might have looked like the following. Woman entrepreneur plus a loan helps her become productive and grow her business into a thriving enterprise. She earns more income, puts more and better food on the table, and has healthy offspring. That could have been the story we told ourselves. In fact, we did tell it in our brochures, but we never really took it apart to see if that theory of change was real and if the assumptions underlying it were real. We tended to look not at outcomes, but at products and models. Was the product going to be a loan? Was it going to be savings? Was it going to be a group model or an individual? And that what institution would match that, an NGO or commercial? And then we were hopeful for certain impacts to happen, community development being one, and enterprise development being another, the growing of somebody's business. That changed too. We had household income smoothing, etc. But those were two dominant themes, let's say, in the 90s. Community development and microenterprise development. And then there were aspirational outcomes, that by doing all these things, we would achieve women's empowerment or poverty alleviation. And in a perfect world, both would happen. So here's an example. I've retrofitted a theory of change onto Comportamos Banco. And here's what it might have looked like. They started with loans and savings, with loans, not savings, and with a group model. Their choices were there and they were clear. But they also really wanted to prove that they could do all of this commercially. And their social goal was microenterprise development. So if they had a commercial institution, and if that commercial institution granted loans through a group model, microenterprise development would ensue, was what I think their theory of change was. Their aspirational results might have been women's empowerment or household poverty alleviation. We don't really know because the theory of change was vague. Final thoughts before we leave the basics. The industry started with delivery models, not with customers. We didn't think about people. We thought about models that would work for them. Group, individual, savings group, etc. We assumed the services delivered through certain models would bring about positive change. Because we had a lot of assumptions and no clear evidence about any of those assumptions, we had a blind spot regarding women, men, and the impact of our services. Bottom line, we objectified men and women, but maybe we forgot to serve them with really quality services that they demanded. Thank you.